Welcome to technical session number 3, the inside of a computer. Today, we're going to be kind of just taking a little bit of a tour so that everybody can kind of get an introduction to some of the components you'll be dealing with, their purposes, how everything fits in, and then we're going to walk through our instructions on proper procedures and measures in taking a computer apart and then putting the computer back together again, because that actually is the biggest key. Anybody can take something apart. The real talent comes in putting it back together and it turning back on. And I will tell you, the first time you strip a computer all the way down to its frame and then put it all the way back together and you fire it up and it gets past post, that is such a great feeling. It is quite the opposite feeling when you press that power button and then the post beeps start going off, because then you got to take everything back apart and start over. But we will go through all these steps throughout the course of this technical session. The behavior, skills, and mindsets we want to keep in mind while working through this session are teamwork and future orientation. Always remember, IT is not an individual activity. It is a team sport. Amongst your team, you're going to have varying levels of skills. You're going to have people that are going to be better at networking. You're going to have people who are going to be better at hardware, people who are going to be better at cloud. And you will lean on these people based on these particular skill sets and learn from them. So you don't necessarily need to be the person that knows all aspects of IT. As we said, anybody who said they know everything about IT, they are lying. Future orientation. We want to know where we're going so that we can make a plan to get there. We want to have our eyes on next week, next month, next year. What are our goals? Set our SMART goals and work towards them. And be sure to do check-ins on our goals on a regular basis to make sure we are progressing towards what we want to achieve. All right. So for this particular one, we are focusing on a desktop computer, not an all-in-one or a laptop. We are specifically speaking about a tower case. Case is also called a chassis. Tower case itself can sit upright, although they do have some that can lie flat as well. This particular one, you can see it has brackets on it. So it can either be stood up or it can be taken out of the brackets and laid down on its side flat on the desktop. Typically comes down to space availability and personal preference. Some people like it laying on their side because it raises their monitor up just a little bit, because they'll set their monitor up on their case. Also, you have mobile cases, laptops, and tablets, which we will not really be getting into in this particular session. In all-in-one cases, everything is encased inside the monitor, and that is both a wonderful thing because it saves space and it's just easy to set up. It's one plug and play. You're good to go. The downside is they are a royal pain to work on. And depending on what goes wrong with it, it may just be easier to and less expensive based on hourly rates to replace the all-in-one unit rather than fix it. So they're difficult to upgrade, difficult to work on as compared to a desktop. All right, what can be found on the case itself? Well, it says CD, but it's been a very, very long time since I've seen just a straight CD-ROM on a desktop. DVD, about the same. You know, you don't really see a lot of DVD-ROMs. Most of them have gone to Blu-ray, Blu-rays as or eliminated the optical drives altogether to save space. So we are going that way now, where you're not seeing optical drives being put into new computers unless it is specifically requested. But if you do, it's typically going to be a Blu-ray drive. Rare cases, you may see a DVD-ROM. You will see ports on the front. Typically, you'll see USBs, and now you'll see USB-Cs, which are slightly different with regards to appearance. You'll have sometimes audio hookups and things like that. And then on the back, there will be a series of other ports that you will come across as well, but we will get into those a little bit later in the discussion. Now, the monitor with regards to laptops and all-in-one is attached to the chassis itself, but with regards to desktops, it is a separate unit. Questions so far? All right. When you first open up the inside of the case, this is essentially what you'll be looking at. The first time you do it, it might be a little intimidating, but not so bad once you get to know it. It may not look exactly like this. Yes, Glean.
So, I don't know if anybody's familiar with this, but the RAID system, will that also, will we be discussing that, and will that be on the test as well for your certification?
The various types of RAID, yes. And you will be initiating at least a software RAID during the course.
Okay. All right, thank you.
So yes, we will be talking about that. RAID arrays, there's 4 of them, technically 5 that you need to be aware of. So internally in the computer, when you look at it, almost every computer you look in is going to be a little bit different, but the general geography remains about the same. You'll have a metal enclosed box in the corner towards the rear of the computer. That is your power supply. All these, this massive bundle of wires coming out supply power to all your components, your motherboard, your CPU, your drive bays, everything supplied through the power supply itself. This piece here in the back, this big blue square, that would be your motherboard. Right here, this black square on top of that, that would be the fan, which underneath that fan would be your CPU. Up near the front, you got your drive bays and these red cables you see coming out of your drive bays connecting down here. Those would be your SATA data cables. But we will be getting into all of this stuff in greater detail in later sessions. This is just kind of an introductory, kind of just showing you what it looks like and what you'll be working with. All right. Motherboard. Basically the backbone of the computer or nervous system, however you want to look at it. You will be required to know the general geography of a motherboard. Like if you look top down on a motherboard, they'll point out a bunch of different things and say, okay, what are we looking at? So the piece that always draws the eye is the central section here. This is the CPU socket. So this is where your central processing unit, the main brain of the computer, the main processing center, that is where that will be placed. And based on looking at this, you will actually be able to know the manufacturer of the chip that is being used. Because there are 2 main manufacturers that we will deal with, which is Intel and AMD. Those are the 2 big players in the CPU world. Can anybody tell me, based on looking at this, just a curiosity, you don't necessarily have to know it right now, do we know which one would, which type of chip would be needed for this motherboard? You got a 50-50 shot. Hey. Intel. We're getting a lot of Intels. Hi. So we got a on this, there's LGA and PGA. So you have land grid array and pin grid array. We will get into that with regards to CPUs. This one actually is an AMD. We can tell because it has a lot of little tiny holes that pins are going to go down into. So you had a 50-50 shot. So, but we will be getting into that later, and pretty soon you'll be able to, just a quick scan, you look at it and be like, all right, it's an AMD board, it's an Intel board, and you'll know right off the bat whether or not you can use whatever chip you have to set with it. With regards to which type of board works with which type of chip, Google's your best coworker. You can look it up, look at the manufacturer's paperwork, and it'll tell you which chips are compatible with which boards. So just to bear in mind. Also, On this, you'll see something right here. It looks like a lot of little spikes sticking up into the air. That is a heat sink to pull heat away from the boards, because as we talked about yesterday, when you push electricity through wires at a high rate, the reaction to that is heat. We have to draw that heat away. We use passive cooling for certain things. So you will see heat sinks like this on certain components. This component is one that you will likely need to know, and it is because it is the largest heat sink closest to the CPU. And we call that the North Bridge. And it serves a very particular function. But we will get into that when we talk about motherboards. You also got your 20-pin connector here. It'll either be 20 or 24 pins. The connectors themselves are 20 plus 4, because sometimes that connector will disconnect and come over and power your CPU. Right here are some of the familiar ports if you've ever looked behind a computer. These are all the various things for your keyboard and your mouse, VGA connectors for your monitors, USBs, networks, and then your audio ports as well. All of this stuff will fit into the back of the casing so that you can see. Am I paused or am I still talking? Okay, because I saw paused in the chat. So, all right. Okay. Now over here, you're going to see PCI slots. These are used for expansion cards, various types of expansion cards. Back in the day when you actually used PCI, it might have been an audio card. It might have been your network card. It might have been improved. I would say improved graphics, but you couldn't really do that through PCI. When we wanted to actually upgrade the graphics, we had to use this right here, which is called the AGP, which is Advanced Graphics Port. Again, we will be talking about a lot of this stuff. We will be talking a lot about the stuff in more detail when we get into motherboards specifically, but this is just like we said, just a basic overview. AGP is when we started getting into graphics cards to improve the graphics of the machines themselves. And that was a bridging technology until we got to PCIes, which are much more advanced PCI slots, and they connect directly into the North Bridge. So that's a much faster connection. Also, these long slots over here is where we will put our added memory, or RAM, random access memory, or volatile memory, or short-term holdings. When our CPU is trying to do lots of computations, it'll hold short-term memory in the RAM and then collect it back when they need it. So this is just a very basic geographical overview of what's going on with the motherboard. We will get into this in more detail next week when we do a technical session specifically on motherboards. Do we have any questions so far? I have one question. Change my color here to make it a little easier. What's this? What are these?
Capacitors.
Capacitors. Very good. How do we know that? Yesterday's homework. Yeah, it looked like batteries. So if ever you're having trouble with your motherboards, when you do open it up, you look at the capacitors, make sure they're not swollen, cracked, or starting to kind of break open. If they do, it means you're replacing that motherboard. So just do a quick eyeball check, make sure the capacitors all look normal. They're not bulging or anything like that. Excellent. And next. Here's a different view of the motherboard, makes some of this stuff a little bit easier to see. Also, they do have PCIe slots, or E stands for express right here. These are smaller ones. So this is PCIe by 1. And then you have an older PCI right here. Here is the CPU socket with the CPU and the cooler fan already in place on top of it. And then your volatile memory right here, your RAM. And then as we stated before, we look for the largest heat sink closest to the CPU. And right here is our north bridge. So that's going to be your biggest chipset with a heatsink on it, closest to your CPU. Although technically nowadays they're actually integrating the north bridge into the CPU.
Kelly, Julian had a question about what the buy 1 and what the buy 16 mean for the
Okay, buy 1, see how short it is right here. And the buy 16 is hard to see because they it blends in with the board really good. So buy 1, see it right here. It's like a real short one. And it has to do with the bus transmission. Buy 16, easier to spot right here. It is a much longer expansion card port. Quickest way to see it visually is just the longest one is a buy 16. There is a possibility for a buy 8, a buy 4, and a buy 1. Buy 1 is just like a little nub right here. And typically what would be used for that would be like a NIC card or something like that. Does everybody see that? I know the blue blended in pretty good. And then over here, this cream colored one, this is the old PCI slot, and they are typically cream colored. Your newer ones are either going to be black or blue, although there are motherboards, especially in gaming computers and stuff like that, that will do everything a single color because it looks, very cool aesthetically. So you won't have the standard colors in like on a gaming motherboard for, PCs like that. And then they'll do the same thing with the wires, where the wires are all black or they're all purple or they're all green to get that certain look. In a typical one, you'll see different colors on the wires here, and those different colors will represent different voltages. On a gaming computer or something like that, where because they're becoming more like art pieces where you're displaying them, as we saw Kayla's computer yesterday. It's more like an art piece that you want to display rather than just a computer. So, they've changed some of the looks of things. And in that case, you may need to use more of a multimeter to determine the voltage of the wires rather than just quick eyeballing the color of them. So any questions so far on this? And then up here is the back side of the ports that you would see on the back of the computer. So that would be your USBs, your audio ports, your network ports, all that kind of fun stuff. So this is just the same motherboard, but at a different angle. Questions? Yes, TestOut does have virtual motherboards you can test on. All right, here's basically, they just flip it around. Yes, clean.
Where would the thermal paste be used?
Thermal paste? Okay, so when you're installing a CPU chip, let me go back to this one so we can see it. So if you remove all of this stuff, the first thing you're going to put in, you'll have that empty socket like right here. So you have that empty CPU socket, right? So you're going to put the CPU in there first, and then you're going to lock it in place. And then in between the CPU and the heat sink that you're going to put on it, you need to put thermal paste, which allows for a more even transfer of heat from the CPU to the heat sink itself. Because the CPU heats up fast. It'll go from room temperature to 500 degrees in under 2 seconds. So when you turn that computer on, it heats up really fast. So the thermal paste just allows for a better transfer of heat from that to the heat sink, so the heat can go up through the metal blades, be dispersed, and then you push air down through it with a fan to accelerate it. Although on gaming PCs and some higher power ones, they'll use different things. Like they'll actually use liquid cooling, which is kind of like it works almost like a radiator in a car, where you have a metal plate attached to it and then it keeps cycling a liquid through there to keep cooling it down. So they do have those as well. And then there's also submerged computers where you actually will submerge the entire computer in liquid and use that as a cooling method. There are some people that do that. It looks kind of cool. It's a little expensive to maintain, but people do it because, it looks neat. You look like you have a computer in a fish tank, essentially. So there are various different cooling methods we'll talk about here in a little bit. So, but it's like a sandwich, you know, you put the CPU on, thermal paste, then your heat sink, which will look kind of like this. And then on top, you will have a big case fan that will go on there that will force air through there to kind of accelerate the cooling. The Northbridge itself doesn't heat up that bad. So it can go with what's just called passive cooling, where you just have a heat sink on top of it, and that is enough to disperse the heat. Good question. All right, now if we flip the board around one more time, you will see this is the back side of the computer. When you look at the back of your computer and you see all your various hookups in the back of the machine, those are physically attached to the motherboard itself. So you got your USB slots. You will have your network slot. You got your DVI port. You got your HDMI ports, display ports, your audio ports here, and then you also have the fiber coax or fiber audio, and then FireWire right here. And try to see if there's any other. I think this is eSATA down here. Yeah, eSATA, the red one down here, which is for external hard drives. So various other ports, and you'll be able to tell generation of USB based off of color. If it's blue, it is a 3.0. If it's black, it's 2. And then beyond that, we're getting into USB-C, which actually gets into a different shape. All right. Questions? Yes, Kayla. Do you have a question or no?
No, I was just saying that if anybody wanted to, they do sell motherboards. This is what I used to study. It helped me remember what everything is. It's a little cheap motherboard my husband got for me, but it helps with studying.
True. And we also will have something that'll help with that. We have a it's called, remember if we did when we did Jamboard and we had the 4 pointers. Sorry, 1 second. When we did the Jamboard, we actually have a Jamboard that has a motherboard with all the parts not labeled but pointed to, so you can work on practicing labeling each part of the motherboard, so you'll become more comfortable with the geography or the layout of the motherboard itself. So, but good tip, Kayla. Thank you. All right. Next, processors. As we talked about, there are the two main types. You have your AMD and you have your Intel, and they go with two. They're considered two styles. One is called LGA, which is land grid array, which is Intel. It means it's flat, like the land. It's very flat, smooth on the bottom, and then the pins will actually be on the motherboard. So you're laying this surface onto the pins of the motherboard itself. And then you have a pin grid array, or PGA, which is the AMD, which has all the pins on the back of the chip itself. And those pins fit down into slots in the motherboard. But again, when we get into CPUs, we'll go over this a little bit more. And we will ask you at least a couple dozen times when you look at the back of a chip, is this AMD or is this Intel? All right. Oh, obviously, CPU determines the computing power or the processing power of the computer itself. And what type you're allowed to use is determined by the motherboard you already have installed. Next, as we talked about just a little bit earlier, you have passive cooling, which here is a heat sink, which will lock down. You typically would use more than passive cooling on your CPU. This, if you just use passive cooling, it may be the north bridge, south bridge, or other various components that may heat up. You will even see tiny little heat sinks on the inside of the CPU when we look inside the CPU. And inside a RAM chip, they have tiny, tiny little heat sinks that they utilize inside there as well. So it's used all throughout the computer. Case fans will attach to the fan, like to the front and back of your case, to direct airflow in and out of your computer system to, you know, have proper heat management. You might think it would be great to just have an open air computer, take it out of the case and just let it breathe. But actually that doesn't work so well. It doesn't allow for proper removal of heat. So you actually need to keep the case relatively closed with the exception of the venting systems. So on the drive bays in the back, there's these metal tabs that cover the drive bays unless they're in use. It is important that they're there and not just thrown away, because if they're not there, then it doesn't allow for proper ventilation and your computer can overheat and actually damage your PC just because it doesn't have the correct airflow. On your CPU, you can kind of see that whole package together here. The CPU is down at the bottom. You got your heat sink right here in the middle, and then the case or the fan on top, forcing air down through the heat sink, accelerating the cooling. Questions so far? Everybody's an expert. I love it.
We're letting it all marinate, Kelly.
We're letting it all marinate.
Marinate, yes.
It's a good day for marinating. Yes, Karen.
So every motherboard has the north bridge and the south bridge. You're saying that those are the passive cooling and the active cooling would be the cooling fans?
Well, what I'm saying is typically your north bridge and south bridge will have a passing cooling unit on it.
Okay.
So underneath this metal, set right here, underneath this, there is going to be a chipset under there, and that is your north bridge.
Okay.
But the cooling unit they're using on top of the north bridge is just a passive heat sink.
Okay. Okay.
The CPU heats up a lot more, so it needs something a little more aggressive. So you'll have a heat sink and a fan on top of it to kind of push more air through there to help it cool down faster.
So both of those are for the that little thing right there. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but
no, ma'am, I can't, unfortunately.
Okay.
Otherwise there'd be like 40 arrows on the screen.
I know, right? So repeat that one more time. I'm sorry. I apologize.
Okay, no problem. No problem. That is why we're here. But we also remember we will be getting in this again later. So right here on the CPU. So get this really big fan on top of it. So underneath this fan, there is a heat sink, and then underneath that is the CPU, which is the central brain of the computer.
Right.
Because of it's being used so heavily and it's, consuming a lot of electricity, it's going to get really, really hot. So they put a heat sink on top of it to kind of draw the heat away. And then they put this fan on top of it to push air through to accelerate the cooling, to make it cool down much faster. Now the north bridge over here in this section doesn't get quite that hot. So we can get by with just this little aluminum plate with the little blades sticking up, because that will just slowly draw the heat up through. And then as the air passes through the computer, that will help disperse the heat. So that's considered passive. There's nothing active going on. We don't have fans running on it, nothing pushing through it. It's passive. It's just sitting there on its own, doing its thing.
Okay. Okay. I got you.
Does that make more sense?
Yeah, that makes more sense. Thank you.
No problem. No problem. Okay. All right, next, memory modules. These would be considered memory banks where we would install our RAM or volatile memory. also considered your short-term memory. And we call it volatile because if the power is ever cut off, all the memory, everything that's stored in these memory modules is wiped off. So every time you turn off your computer, these essentially are erased. So it's considered volatile memory. And they are stored in banks. And you see the different colors here, like there's a black, blue, black, blue. So this would be like bank 1, 2, 3, and 4. You can run what's called single channel, which means you only have one memory module in there, and that's what it operates off of. Or on this one, you could actually do what's called dual channel. And what dual channel is if when I install memory modules, I install one in bank 1, this black one right here, and then I would install one in bank 3, this other black one here. I would switch it to dual channel in the BIOS. We'll show you how to do this. And those two memory modules will operate as a single unit. So it allows you to really improve your memory. They also have triple channel. All right, questions so far? But again, we'll do an entire session just on RAM. So we'll be doing that next week. All right. Now, you see on these, these are all RAM chips or RAM blades, however you want to put them. They have these little notches on either side. And then you see these gold connectors or copper connectors right here on the edges. When you push them down into the board, they have these little clips that come up and lock it in place. You do have to kind of give it a little bit of pressure when you're installing them to make sure they lock in properly. They also have a little notch right here, if you see it. Not sure if it's very clear on your screens. But like right here, you got a little notch cut in the connector. That notch will actually match up with the notch in the board. So if you see it right here, there's a notch in the board. And the placement of that notch is so that you don't put the wrong type of RAM in. It's based off of generation. So is it a DDR1, a DDR2, DDR3? Each generation of RAM, that notch is going to be in a different place so that you can't put the improper RAM in the motherboard. So it's a nice little fail-safe. And when you put up the RAM next to the notch, you can quickly see if that notch lines up properly. If not, you're probably using the wrong generation of RAM. All right. Now, like we were talking about yesterday, if the component is not in use and it is not catastrophically damaged, it may be something that you're going to use later, like you may use the RAM you take out of this computer on an older computer, something along those lines, because as we talked about IT budgets, they don't give us an unlimited money supply. We tend to have to do the best we can with what we got, so we reuse what we're able to reuse, and we tend to store anything that is not broken or that is repairable and try to get it back up and running. So you may reuse pieces from newer computers in older computers to kind of give them a little extra life. When we are storing these things, moving them around right up until the point we're going to pull them out and install them, we keep them in the anti-static bag so that we do not damage them. And then when we do pull them out, make sure hold them by the edges. Don't touch these nice little connectors here because we have oils on our skin, and those oils on our skin will rust out these connector pieces, and then they won't work quite as well. So always keep your fingers on the edges. Same goes for motherboards. Keep your fingers on the edges. Don't actually carry it from underneath because there's solder points under there, and those points can be sharp and cut you. So another safety tip when handling motherboards, also handle strictly from the edges. Never touch the board chip, these center black squares, never touch them. with your fingers or a magnetized screwdriver. Magnetized screwdriver may actually damage the chip and cause catastrophic failure. All right, questions so far? Just a reminder, this is just an overview. We're not expecting all this to stick the first time we see it. It's just kind of letting you know what's coming down the pipe. Yes, Glean.
Most motherboards universal in their sizes. What I mean by that is that you can have there's so many different casings for the computer, but apparently certain motherboards can only fit in certain casings, or is it that the motherboard is universal and that it doesn't matter which case you put in so long as you're able to put everything else in?
That is a great question. There are different size motherboards, but it's not like there's like 50 different kinds. There's like, I mean, you have the ATX, you have the micro, the mini, the ITX. I mean, there's a few that we're going to go over, but they tend to have pretty standard sizes and shapes with regards to screw placements and stuff like that. And just depending on the case, you want to know, like, can it handle an ATX or do I need to use a mini? Something along those lines. And usually you can see that pretty readily when you're looking at the casing. Like when you're if you're buying a case, it'll say, for use with these motherboards, but the screw patterns are the same. And with some of the larger ones, like one that can hold an ATX, you can use a mini in there because they have the same screw pattern. It's just a smaller motherboard. But we'll get into that when we talk about motherboards, I believe on Monday. Do you have a question, Julian, or are you just kind of just hanging out?
No, I'm good. I'm just stretching.
Got it. Fair point. We'll be taking a break here in a minute. All right, drives, various types of drives you may see in a computer. You may see optical drives, though less and less as we move forward. In an enterprise setting, you'll likely see drives for quite some time because many of the desktop computers are going to be a little bit older if you're working in larger offices. When I was working in transportation, we were lucky if we got a computer within the current decade. It was just, they were older computers. We weren't using programs that were heavily processing intensive. As long as it can run the operating system, they still worked for us. So they got as much life out of those computers as they possibly could. Many offices will operate this way because it's much cheaper than buying 10,000 new computers every 3 or 4 years. So they will continue to use those as long as they can continue to get life out of them. They will depreciate them over the course of 10 years plus. If you're in an office where they're doing graphics design or video or audio rendering, totally different story. They're probably going to be upgrading those machines every 2-3 years at most. So, but optical drives, these are kind of going by the wayside. They're quickly becoming a legacy technology just because flash drives like USBs and stuff like that can store a lot more information and have a faster transfer speed. So it is almost pointless to utilize optical drives at this point, except for older programs, things like that. Solid state drives. These are also becoming significantly more common because they are faster, although they are more expensive than your mechanical drives. They are faster, they are more durable, and they actually fit into a smaller footprint as well. Next, we have our hard disk drive, or HDD. This is also typically called a mechanical drive. The SSD has no moving parts, no mechanical parts. The HDD has moving mechanical parts. We will get into like the internal components on it and show you everything. They have platters that spin and heads that read off of it almost like a record player. They use magnetic read-write heads to put the information on and remove it from the disk, but they are also very sensitive. If they're jarred, jostled, dropped, they can be broken or damaged relatively easily. This is why, especially in laptops and things like that, they're moving away from these mechanical drives. Desktops, to a degree, still use them because you can get fairly large storage drives in a mechanical for significantly cheaper than you could on a solid state. Although that gap is narrowing very quickly because solid states are becoming significantly more common, economies of scale, bringing the cost down. And now we're seeing thumb drives that'll hold up to about a terabyte, which is pretty crazy when you consider not 10 years ago, what you could get like, 200 megs on one and be like, yes. So it's getting quite easier to transfer data and stuff like that. So, all right, expansion slots. This would be the PCI, the PCIe, the AGP slots that we talked about a little bit earlier. Remember me telling you the PCI slots typically were a cream color. AGP tends to be brown. And then your PCIe slots predominantly are blue, though on occasion they may be black. But again, we will go over that again with motherboards. Expansion slots. These are like things that you can add aftermarket to improve the functionality and capabilities of your machines. This could be graphics cards. It could be audio cards. It could be if the NIC goes bad, you can replace the NIC so that you can add another modem. There's a bunch of other things that you can use these slots for to add functionality to the machines that you are working from. Questions so far? Yes, you literally can fill out every single slot. Depending on the motherboard you have. The slots on the back, because you may have like 10 slots on the back of your computer, but your motherboard may only have 3. So you can fill out every slot on the motherboard. So long as your computer can handle it. And hopefully you do not have to buy a graphics card in the near future, because unfortunately they are just crazy expensive right now, if you can find one. Yes, Glean.
Now, graphics for these, I was about to say, graphics cards or audio cards also have their own little cooling units with them. Is that true?
Yes. We're about to see one here in just 1 second. So yes, they do. Yes, Karen.
With adding those extra slots, do you need more memory, or is that the memory that you're adding with the audio cards?
The expansion slots are that is not your memory.
Okay.
So that's 2 different things. Let me go back here real quick so I can show you, get a good look here. So up here, these are your expansion cards that will be in those metal slots in the back of the computer. So that's up here.
Okay.
Your RAM bank, where you would add extra memory, is usually pointed in a different direction. So over here, this is where you would add extra memory.
Okay.
So that's typically pointed in a different direction.
So when you're adding those extra cards, do you add more memory also to accommodate them, or is that not necessary?
That is a fantastic question. Actually, it would depend, but depending on what you're adding, you may want to add more memory. Some things, when you install them, like the graphics card that Glean was just talking about, come with their own memory on it.
Okay.
So some of them actually have, that's why the question was so nice, because you're saying, does it come with it or do you add it? It depends. Some of them actually come with their own. Some of those components may actually take up more memory. You may need to add more.
Okay.
You may actually have extra memory, like not really extra, I mean, because the typical answer for RAM, and when they ask how much do you want, you how much can I get?
Yeah.
But if you have RAM that's available that you're not necessarily currently using, you can still use it. And you don't need to add more for the components you put in. So it depends. We got to work with the specifications is what it comes to, but that is a fantastic question. So yes, some come with their own, some we may need to add more. Some are just okay as they are. All right. All right, expansion slots. Here's kind of what we were talking about. So you have the PCIes. These 3 are PCI. They have that cream color. This is the oldest, slowest connection. When you get into PCIe's, which are down here, here's a black one. They're either black or blue. Those hands down the fastest. These have the closest, most direct connection to the CPU. They will have the fastest connection. So if at all possible, you want to use a PCIe if you can. The bridging technology that was in between the PCI and the PCIe was the AGP, the Advanced Graphics Port, or Accelerated Graphics Port, excuse me. Developed so that you could actually utilize a graphics card to improve your output on your PC. So that was utilized for a little while, and then not too long after the PCIe came out. And predominantly, if you have a graphics card, you want to try to use PCIe, and as a backup, use a AGP. Yes, eventually PCI slots will be gone. They do still maintain a lot of times 1 or 2 on a board just for legacy expansion cards, because some people have use them for specific types of connectors for older equipment, but they are kind of being phased out. Because more often, and the same goes for the AGP slots too, they're kind of phasing those out as well. They're pushing more and more just for being able to fit a couple more AG or PCIe slots rather than use an AGP or a PCI, because all the real estate on a motherboard is precious. And more, if it's all possible, we try to integrate things, because the more integrated it can become and the closer it can get to the CPU, the faster it becomes. It may not seem like a lot, but a couple inches on a bus going from the CPU to the South Bridge makes a lifetime of difference with regards to speed. We're talking nanoseconds in how fast it can transfer information, but the volume of information it needs to transfer adds up over time, slows things down. So we want to get things closer to the CPU, more integrated into either the board or the chips. And that's what, that's where we start seeing those big gains in performance. Questions so far?
Yes. Mark, could you expand a little bit more what you just put in the chat? Take note of the color of the different slots. Sorry, Kelly, to just kind of, you asked for questions. I'm like, yeah, anyway, Kelly, so Mark.
Yeah, well, that will help you visually identify particular slots. Once you start getting into test out, you may be looking for things that it's a little hard sometimes to
Gotcha.
find what you may be looking for in test out, but looking at the colors of the different slots will help you identify them a lot quicker.
To zone in on it. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And even in real life too, when you get looking at a real life motherboard also, you'll be able to identify those areas a lot quicker.
Yeah. So PCI's cream color, AGP's brown, PCI Express or PCIe is either blue or black.
Okay, and see, that's what I was going to double back to you, Kelly, on and confirm about what you said earlier. So you guys are awesome. Thank you for bringing it together a little bit better for me.
Not a problem. And again, the notable exception of this is if you're looking at gaming motherboards and stuff like that, where they're going to be more of a uniform color or they're going for particular looks. Because when you start looking at some of these gaming PCs, some of them are pretty gorgeous. And some of them will do like wall builds where like they have it up on the wall, literally like an art piece designed out. I mean, if you look up some of the builds that people do on Google, you'll see some really, really amazing, just beautiful PCs. So there was one guy, there was an amazing build on YouTube. If I find it, I'll show it to you guys. It was a $40,000 computer built into a desk. This thing was just super powerful, just amazing build. And it ended up costing close to 40 grand. And this was before the graphic cards went nuts in price. Let's see if I can find that YouTube video and I'll drop it in the Slack for you guys. It's pretty amazing to see what, them build it out. All right. Expansion cards. Here's a closer look. As we were talking earlier, if you look at this is actually a graphics card for those of you who have built computers. Yes, I know it's an old one, but it doesn't have the cover on it, so it makes it a little easier to see what's going on. So this in and of itself, being a graphics card, you can see the VGI and the DVI ports for, monitors or TVs. It's got its, a couple capacitors on there. And amazingly, this almost looks like its own mini motherboard. If you look at it, it looks almost like a motherboard, but it's an expansion slot. Right here underneath this is your big cooling unit. There's a fan and a heat sink right here. Underneath this is the GPU or graphics processing unit. So this would look almost similar to your CPU on your motherboard. Over here, you got a heat sink sitting on top of what would essentially be RAM. So it has its own RAM built into it, and they got a heat sink put on top of it to kind of keep everything cool. It has its own version of a North Bridge. So this is essentially what would be a graphics card, but everything here, if you lay it down next to a motherboard, it looks almost exactly like a motherboard, and you can sit there and point out the various components on there. And, we utilize this to help augment or aid in improving our own PC performance. Again, I know this is an older, graphics card, but it kind of lets you see everything and kind of the general premise and how it works. Four pin, 8-pin, 15, or with regards, yes, it should be about a whole, but what are you speaking about for 4-pin, 8-pin, and 15-pin? Are you talking about by 4, by 8, and by 16, Julian?
Like on those little connectors right there, it says 15-pin analog video port.
Yes, that would be a DB15. It's called a DB15 or a VGA port. And then actually the 15-pin is the number of little holes in there. Yes.
Thank you.
But the shorthand name for it would be DB15. Or commonly referred to as a VGA, and DB is short for D sub miniature, but we will talk more about that when we get into cables and connectors. So that'll make sense. And then this is a DVI. All right. Okay. Power supplies converts AC to DC. So alternating current to direct current. When the current that comes out of the wall into whatever electronic device you're using is alternating current. But the components inside the computer can't operate off of alternating current. It needs direct current. So the power supply itself converts that from AC to DC. Typically, power comes in from the electrical receptacles, depending on where you are geographically. If you're in Europe or Asia, South America, Africa, it may be 220. In the US, parts of the Caribbean, and there's a few other places I can't think of off the top of my head that use 110. Virgin Islands. And on the back of the power supply, there'll be a little red switch that goes back and forth that will allow you to select whether you're at 110 or 220. So it lets the power supply know what it's about to receive. If you go over to Europe and you have it set at 110 and you plug it in, you can fry your components because it's expecting much lower voltage and it gets a much higher push. It can damage the computer. If you're set at 220 and you come to America and plug it in, it may not work as well, but you're not as likely to damage it. So just be sure to check the back of it. Make sure everything is set properly. It's a little red selector switch just below where the plug goes into the back of the computer. More often nowadays, like more modern, newer power supplies, there's an auto selector. We don't have to worry about it anymore. Some of the older power supplies that are 10 plus years old, they still have the selector switch. So we need to be aware of that. All right. Now, thank you, Mark. Now, inside the computer, all components in the computer have 5 different voltages they can use. I have to adjust this because it always tricks people. So I'm gonna, there. All right. So inside a computer, you can either use plus or minus 12 volts, plus or minus 5 volts, or positive 3.3 volts. All components inside a computer operate off of one of those 5 different voltages. Multiple test questions. So definitely take note of that. Positive 3, positive or negative 5, positive or negative 12. And the capacity, like how many components you can use for the power supply, is measured in watts. But again, we'll do a whole technical session just on power supplies. Those are the only volts that come out of a power supply. So plus or minus 12, plus or minus 5, plus or minus 3.3. All right, any questions? Yes, these are standards. The various voltages that we need to be aware of. And let me erase that again, just so they just put that in a slightly different order. It wouldn't have confused people. So 3.3 plus or minus 5, plus or minus 12. All right. Moving, see here, the next one. All right, we'll answer these real quick. I'm gonna grab my nice little randomizer here. Get my notator. Ready to go. All right, what we got? Jalea, what is this right here? All right, next, Susan. Can you tell me what this is in the upper left?
Is that the CPU?
It absolutely is the CPU.
Woohoo.
Nice. All right. Mark L. Please tell me what this is right here, upper center. Nope. Try. You can type it in chat, Mark. What is the upper center? It's blocked. GPU. Very good, Mark. Thank you. That's very weird. Let's look at that. All right. Julian, what's the upper right, please?
That's the power supply.
Power supply. Very good. Hunter. What do we have for the bottom left here?
It looks like the fan that would go over the CPU.
That is correct. That is the cooling fan for the CPU. Ronald, can you please give us that bottom center, please?
That's the RAM.
The RAM. Very good, sir. And see, Akedra, can you please give us the bottom right? All right, let's go with Solomon. Bottom right, please. What do we got there? Right here.
Hard drive.
Hard drive. Very good. All right, with that, go ahead and take a quick 10-minute break. Nice work, everyone. We'll meet back here at 10:40 Eastern Standard Time, and we will continue. If you have questions, please let us know. It's amazing how often, Mark, restarting fixes the problem. All right. See everyone back in just a few minutes.
Really quick, Kelly, I experienced the same thing Mark did. As you can see, I'm able to share my video and speak, but randomly, as I was taking notes and I looked up, I did see something that says block, Zoom went completely down. My computer just on its own turned off. And I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Everything came back. So I was like, all right, maybe just an update I missed. So being that Mark said it, I just wanted to just say, I don't know what it is, but I saw something similar.
It actually could be the most recent update that rolled out. Because they just rolled out an update like less than a week ago.
Yeah.
So that may actually be what's causing it is the update.
Okay, because Zoom did have an update. I think it made me update it like 2-3 days ago. Yeah, like literally a few days ago. Okay. All right. I'm gonna take
that may be what's causing it.
You gotta love it. All right, cool beans. Thank you.
No problem. All right, so the 4 steps, we will get into each of these as we go into taking a computer apart. First, you want to plan and organize your work. Next, open the computer case and examine the system. Next, remove components, move slot components, and then finally remove the main components. Now, critically, do not forget, I will tell you this repeatedly, do not forget, before you ever crack a case, 2 big things. 1, make sure you back up everything before you crack the case. I will tell you this, most people do not think about or worry about backups until they have their first big data loss. And I'll tell you right off the bat, it's terrible when it's yours. It's 10 times worse if it's a customer's. So always remember, back up your data before you crack the case. The other thing is, make sure you have a good reason for cracking the case. Make sure you know what you're going in for. Exploratory surgery on a computer, try to avoid it unless you're in a classroom setting. Because each time you crack the case and you start messing around with components, you're increasing the likelihood of damaging those components. So we want to be sure if we're going in, we have a good reason as to why. So when you're getting ready to do this, if it's not your computer, you want to have a conversation with the customer saying, hey, we're going to be cracking the computer or cracking the case on the computers, to go in there because you have a dead CMOS battery. We just need to swap out the battery, or we're going in to add more RAM. But for whatever reason, you're letting them know that you're going to be opening up the computer, going in and essentially handling components inside the computer. You want to take detailed notes and or pictures of the outside of the case and the state of the case before you open it up. Note any defects. Are there big, dents in the side of the case that could indicate that this computer was dropped at some point? Scrapes, scratches, broken ports. All this stuff needs to be documented, as it will cover you in case they later come back and say, hey, there's a problem with this. And this will also be helpful to you as to looking to where the problem may be if there's external physical damage on the computer itself. Questions so far? All right. So number 1, planning and organizing your work. You want to have a clean, organized workstation. You want it cleared off, set, ready to go, depending, based on what you're doing. You don't want a whole bunch of papers and other computer components and all that stuff stacked all over it, not giving you much room to work. You want to have a nice, clean, organized work area before you open the case. Again, reiterating, back up all data on the computer before you open the case. And you should have enough space to set out all components you're going to be working with without stacking them, and not putting them to where they're touching each other, so that there is no chance of ESD. Now, when you're taking things out, when you start taking things out, you want to take detailed notes. Amazingly and wonderfully, we have the ability to do that in our pockets. We have a cell phone. Take tons of pictures. Use something to notate your orientation on the computer. So if you know where the front of the computer is, lay lay something on the front of it so that you know the orientation of your picture. This is the front of the case. So you want to have something that points to you so you can orient the pictures properly. As you're removing each component, continue to take pictures, because it is really nice to know where things go back, especially when you're talking about front case connectors and things like that. So you always take detailed pictures. You can take 20, 30, 40 pictures. It's fine. When you're done, you can delete them and you're good to go for the next one. Or if there's something odd that you see, save that picture so you can show the customer later. I learned this lesson working on cars. When you're taking apart pieces on a car, take a bunch of pictures as you go. That way, when you're putting everything back together, you know how everything fits. Yes, Mark.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that, just sharing from my own experience. So you may see, 4 PCIe slots, not all of them have the same speed, you know. The same for your NVMe drives, you know, your hard drive, each slot has a different rating. So if it may fit where you put it. However, if you don't put it back in the right slot, it'll slow down their drive. Same for the RAM. It may be 4 slots for the RAM, but if you don't put them in the right slots, it won't be dual channel, it'll be single channel. So you'll actually affect the customer's performance by not putting it back exactly how it was.
Or if you have 2 4 gig and 2 8 gig RAM slots and you pair them up wrong.
Exactly, yeah. That'll screw things up as well.
Yeah. So it's little things like that. And that's where like taking pictures is just a huge help. Yes, Glean.
Because I'm going to put my first PC together this coming December. Like build it from scratch. So with that detail that Mark just listed out, does the motherboard list out in terms of what RAMs go in what slots or what expansion modules go into? Like
what it usually comes down to is it'll tell you, I mean, typically the RAM bank speeds are the same, typically.
Okay.
Now, which RAM banks work with, which slots work with the others, that's where the issue is. And usually it's like the odds work together and the evens work together. If you have 4, they'll be color coordinated, you know, so you'll have 2 black, 2 brown, and they'll be or 2 black, 2 blue, they'll be alternated, or yellow and red is another combination they like to use. So they'll be alternating so that you know which 2 banks go together, and then you go into the BIOS and you set it. The problem is if you have mismatched speeds to where, you know, like you put a 4 with an 8, you won't get the speed out of the 8. You'll only get 2 4s essentially. They won't work properly. So that's what they're meaning by mismatching the speeds. So there's that. What was your other question?
No, that was it.
That was it. Okay, yeah, and a lot of that is either it's in the manufacturer's paperwork, all that kind of fun stuff. So just kind of look at the documentation before you start installing the stuff, and it'll really save you a lot of headaches. So, all right. So we want to keep a clean area. Don't have everything, you know, to where it can touch or be stacked. So you want to make sure you have enough clear space to work. One of the big things right here, you know, take pictures. That is such a great thing. And then the other big thing is something called screw mapping. As you're taking the screws, especially if you're talking about mobile devices, I'll get to you in just one second, Jessica. If you're talking about mobile devices, they have screws in it that are different lengths, different threading, you know, so they could be, you know, different types of screws, and you want to make sure you know exactly where they go back. You can have some mats will have depressions in them where you can kind of lay them out how they're supposed to go. But a quick and easy way is just, you know, like if you have a piece of paper, you know, laid out, you just kind of draw a little circle in representation of where you pulled it out, and you put the screw in the circle. And then like you might have one here in the center, put the screw there, one on the back, put the screw in there. So you pull them out in a methodical manner, and you lay them out on a piece of paper so you know exactly where these screws go. That way, when you go put them back, you're not putting a longer screw into a shorter thread and cross threading it, or not able to tighten it down enough so that the component is secure.
Okay. Can someone take over for 2 minutes?
All right, one quick question, Jessica, and then I got to take a quick 30-second break.
Really quickly, I was just curious, especially because, not to be rude, sometimes people accidentally damage their, you know, equipment. They won't tell you, but they want to see if you go figure it out. Like cell phones, the whole white dot, if it gets dropped in water, the white dots turn red. By chance, are there any immediate, like, oh no, this person did this to this computer, like upon opening a computer, when you start taking it apart, are there any indicators that are like pre-placed where from a site you're like, I'm not touching this computer because too much has happened, if that makes sense?
Well, sometimes they have a tape on there that will let you know if they've opened the case. So that's a real big indicator. There's like a tape that it tears if you try to take it off, and that tells you the case has been opened. So that would be a warning sign. If there's physical damage to the case, broken clips, but these are all things you would take pictures of and notate for the customer, and then just bring it to their attention and say, I just want to make sure you were aware of this before we proceeded.
Gotcha. So you do want to bring it to their attention, the dents and this and that.
Yes.
You want to
So
just say, hey.
you want to collect it all first and then bring it to them, because you don't want to call them for every single one, so you want to make a general notation and then call.
Okay, gotcha. Cool
All right.
beans. Thank you.
Bear with me for about 30 seconds. I will be right back. I apologize. If you have any questions, Mark can probably help you. I just got to step outside for like 1 second. I apologize. Here we go. Switch to annotation. There we go. Next, you want to make sure you have your ESD mat, gloves, or bracelet ready and accessible for when you open up that case. For those of us who have it, tie back loose hair, remove jewelry. Never reach into a computer that is connected to a power source. Never, ever reach in if it is connected to a power source. We're going to disconnect it. Well, first we're going to power it down, then we're going to disconnect it. Then we're going to press that button, hold it for 5 seconds to dispel any charge held by capacitors. So we want to render it safe to work on. Any components you pull out, you hold them by the edges, not by the connectors. Don't ever touch the connectors. Don't ever touch the chips. Either, because the oils on our hands can damage either, as well if we are not properly grounded with the ESD bracelet or the gloves. A very slight, ESD discharge of 100 volts from our fingers, which we would never feel, could catastrophically damage the chips. So you want to minimize any potential for that happening. Always handle components from their edges. All right. Next, step 2, open the computer case and examine the system. So powering on the computer, like we just said, unplug all external connections, press and hold power button for 3 to 5 seconds to make sure everything is safe. Open the case cover. Some have a little clip that you pop and it just removes out. Some of them have screws. Some of them have clips that you have to pop out. Each case is a little bit different, but thankfully they're relatively self-explanatory as you're trying to open them from the side. They typically open from one side, not both, because the motherboard is going to be physically attached to the other side. Now, when you're pulling cables out, take note of any cables that may have a yellow triangle on it, as this yellow triangle is an indicator of where pin 1 is located. This is a universal symbol. Whenever you see that triangle, that lets you know where pin 1 is. Sometimes when you're putting a CPU in, that CPU can go in multiple directions, but there'll be a little triangle on the corner of the CPU, a little triangle on the board of the motherboard, and that tells you you're going to put that triangle with the triangle, so pin 1 is in the proper slot. Same thing can happen for connectors. Always take note of this, so you know where pin 1 is located. All right. Take a brief look around, look for any damage that you may visibly see before you reach in. Notate that, take pictures, locate all your major components. Should be able to readily identify power supply, motherboard, drives, and other various components. And then follow their connections as well. Take pictures of where their connectors are hooked up. That way, when you put everything back together, you know where everything goes. All right. Once the computer case is open, you've done a brief examination. You want to go ahead and attach your ESD bracelet to the chassis or stand on the grounding mat before you reach inside the computer. As we talked about a little bit earlier, as you're removing the screws, please keep them organized in cups or on a piece of paper or what have you, just so you know they go back in the proper location when you put them back in. Some people have a methodology to where they, to the way they pull out screws, and this makes it easier. Like they always start in the northwest corner and then work clockwise and go around the entire device. And that just lets them know when they put screws back in, they work in reverse, coming back around. So you create a methodology that works for you, use it every single time. If you use it every single time, it becomes hard to forget to do something. As we state, continue to document and take pictures as you're removing components, just to be sure to note the state of everything as you're removing it. All right, step 3, remove slot components. So you start this by removing all expansion cards. Some may be connected to the case by screws. So you want to make sure you undo those first before pulling the cards out. When you're pulling the cards out, you always, if you need to rock them, you rock them edge to edge. You do not rock them back and forth. You can snap the cards if you rock them the other way. So if you're going to rock them, it goes edge to edge to pull them out. They shouldn't take a lot of force to remove them or to install them. If it's taking a lot of force to install, stop. You're probably doing something wrong. All right. Again, do not touch connectors on components as you're pulling them out. After this, move over to your RAM. The RAM is really nice and easy to install. You have these little clips on the edges here. You just put your thumbs down on those and you push down, they push out and down, and they kind of eject the RAM up. So it's easy to just kind of pull out and remove. And then it's just a reverse, and you put them in, you push them down until those little tabs right there slip up and then click in place. All right, step 3, or continuation of step 3, excuse me. Next, you can remove the CPU. First, you're going to take the case fan. You're going to unplug the case fan, unscrew it. Usually has 4 screws. You're going to use an X method. You don't just go, when you're removing a fan or something like that, you don't go 1, 2, 3, 4. It's kind of like when you're removing a tire from a car. You do 1, then you go to the opposite one, then you go up and over. It's the X method. Boom, 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 boom. That way, it doesn't get out of alignment too bad. It doesn't bend. And when you're removing it or installing it, it decreases your chances of breaking it. All right, so once you get that off, then you got to remove the heat sink, which either unclips or unscrews, utilizing the X method, like we said. Now, there are 2 ways to get it off, because the thermal paste that you use in the CPU may act almost like a glue or adhesive, kind of holding it in place. So you might try a slight twist. If that doesn't work, you can always use dental floss, unwaxed. So unwaxed, unflavored dental floss, and you put it in between the heat sink and the CPU, and you slide it through like you're cutting cheese or bread or something like that, and it will dislodge the heat sink from the CPU, allow you to pull it off. You could look at the thermal paste, see if the thermal paste is dried and flaky. You probably need to add some more, clean that off and add more thermal paste. If it's still kind of moist, then it's still good to go. You can go ahead and reapply it so long as it has pretty good coverage over the CPU. Yes, Hunter.
What should you use to clean off the thermal paste, like an isopropyl alcohol or just water? Or...
I would check manufacturing on that one, because they will tell you exactly what you need to use. Typically, it would be just something dry. You would not typically put any kind of liquid in there. You just try to wipe it off as best you can and then reapply. If it's dried and crusty, it's going to come off kind of easily. Like if it's dried and cracking and flaky. So you typically wouldn't use any kind of liquids inside the computer. So, all right.
Okay, wait, add. I want to add something.
Sorry, was there?
Okay.
So yeah, no liquids inside the computer. And all right, document the status of the thermal compound like we just said, and then you place the CPU in an anti-static bag. Don't just set it on the table or something along those lines. And please use a chip extractor when you're pulling the CPU out. Don't make the same mistake my TA did when I was in the class. Not Mark, the TA that was teaching me. All right. Next, step 4, remove main components. So you're going to go ahead and remove your power supply. Many of them allow the connectors to kind of be removed, which makes it kind of easy. And you can remove the power supply. Some cases have a really nice feature where the power supply just kind of folds out, but it stays attached, but it gets it out of your way. So it'll just fold up and out. And then on the other side, it'll fold up and out on the drives. A lot of the ones you'll find in schools and stuff like that, the ones we had in our labs, they just folded out. So it was very easy to get the power supplies out. So you would actually remove those, and then you could move on to your motherboard. Main connectors, your case connectors, your SATA, your PATA, IDE, get all those disconnected. These are your front panel connectors right here, which connects your motherboard to your case. System fans that may be in the way, disconnect all of these. And once those are clear, set aside your drives. Then you can remove the motherboard itself. Now, with removing screws for the motherboard, all the screws on the motherboard should be the exact same size. So those can all go in the same cup. Use the X method for removing the screws on this. And then in reverse, when you're putting it in, you use the same method so it doesn't bend or crack the motherboard itself. Here's the thing. When you're pulling the motherboard out, you may not be able to just lift it. You may have to kind of twist it, not, like kind of change your angle a little bit, but whatever you do, don't bend the motherboard. However it got in there, it didn't have to be bent to go in there. So if you're in a situation where you think you have to bend it, change your angle a little bit because it means something isn't right. So you should be able to lift it up and out easily, holding it by the edges. So just something to be aware of. Then you set that aside. You should be down to just a straight chassis at that point and all your components laid out neatly. It's very rare that you're going to take everything out of a computer, but these would be the basic directions you would follow to get there. Questions so far? Okay, so now once that's done, I have a video here that can kind of basically demonstrate exactly what we did. Sorry, what did somebody say something?
Julian had a question about whether or not to put the motherboard in an anti-static bag once you remove it.
If you have a bag for it, yes, absolutely use it. And yes, you can reuse anti-static bags. So if you were, that's what I was saying yesterday, like when you receive components, like if you're building your own and you pull the components out and you install them and you have those anti-static bags, don't throw them away. Keep a few of them, fold them up, put them in your tool bag. Always good to have a few of those on hand just in case. You can keep reusing them. So long as they're big enough to fit whatever component you're using, you can reuse them. Eventually, you will remember these steps, Karen, but we can, you can write them out. We'll go over them. You're going to see these exact same steps at least 10 to 15 times because there's different components where they're going to say, okay, here's the steps to removing this component. Here's the step to removing this component. You'll start to notice that all the steps are essentially the same. So we'll review them quite a few times. All right. Good question, though. All right, stop share so I can share computer sound.
You may already know that there are many important parts inside a computer, but what exactly do they do? Let's take a look inside and learn about the various components that make a computer work. Whether it's a desktop computer or a laptop, every computer has a large circuit board called a motherboard. This contains some of the most important parts of the computer, such as the CPU, also known as the central processing unit or processor. The CPU can be considered the brain of the computer because it processes information and carries out commands. Since it tends to get hot, it's covered by a piece of metal called a heatsink, which draws heat away from the processor. The motherboard also contains the computer's RAM, or random access memory. This is the short-term memory that the computer uses whenever it's performing calculations. However, you cannot store your files there, because the RAM is cleared when you shut off the computer. The hard drive provides long-term storage, keeping all of the computer's data even when it's turned off. Many hard drives use a magnetic platter to store data, but many newer computers have solid-state drives, which are faster and more durable, but also more expensive. On many desktop computers, the motherboard has expansion slots that allow you to upgrade by adding expansion cards. You can add a video card to get better graphics performance, or you can add a wireless card to connect to your wireless home network. Most laptops, however, don't have expansion slots. Of course, the computer's components need electricity to run. The power supply unit is designed to take power from the wall outlet and send it to all of the different components that need power. Laptops also contain a built-in battery that lets you use them anywhere. A computer is a pretty complex machine, but now that you've seen what goes on inside, it should be a little less mysterious.
GCF Global, creating opportunities for a better life.
All right. It was just a quick synopsis of what we just went over. And we have a little quiz. And whoops. Now we got to put the sucker back together. We've done all this work getting it pulled apart. We got to put it back together. Beauty part is everything we just did, we're going to do it in reverse. So step one, place the motherboard carefully back inside the holes, making sure all the screw holes line up. Your rear ports are sticking out that the rear compartment so that they fit in there properly. Then you go ahead and you put the screws back in using the X method to make sure the board is secured. Once we've done that, attach your drives, fans, making sure they're put back in their housings. Start connecting your chassis front panel connectors down to the motherboard. Attach the supply back into the power supply back into place. Some cases, like I said, it angles out, then you just gotta roll it back in, and then you can go ahead and start hooking everything up. Start attaching all your power supply connectors up to your motherboard and whatever you have already set up. Then you got to start putting in your CPU. Put your CPU back in place using the ZIF, or zero insertion force locking mechanism that's going to hold that chip in place. We will mention that again when we get to CPUs, don't worry. Then apply the thermal paste on top of that. Small amounts, usually about the size of a pencil eraser or a pea. That's about all you need. Although thankfully, if it's a new build, usually the heat sink on the bottom of it already has the thermal paste applied. You just have to pull off a little strip and set it on there and you're all good to go. Yes, go ahead, Glean.
Can you bring that first slide of the reassembly back a second? I missed it.
Yes.
No,
This one or one more?
Yeah, that one.
That one. Okay. Motherboard back in. Let me know when you're good. All right. Then again, step two, all drives and fans go back into their housing. Connect all cables to the board. Don't forget your SATAs, your IDEs, your PATAs, and your front panel connectors. Then you bring your power supply back in place. That's number 4. Making all connections back to your drives, your motherboard, your CPU. Then you put your CPU back in using the ZIF locking mechanism, put it back in place, put thermal paste on top of that. Then you put your heat sink on top of it, and you put the CPU fan on top of that. Everything locks back down into place. Next, we insert our RAM modules, being sure to locate the notch in the slot, insert and make sure we insert it straight down. Push straight down, thumbs on either side, equal force on both sides. Do not rock back and forth because you can damage and or break the RAM module. Step number 7, insert all your expansion cards as documented. If it's got a GPU, likely there will be a power connector for it. So you will need to be able to attach the power supply to that as well. Place the cover back on, the case cover back on according to the removal process, whether it be screws, clips, or a latch. Then we will attach all external connectors and peripherals that you had, including the monitor, keyboard, mouse, USB, and power cord. And then we start the computer by pressing the power button, listen for any unusual noise, smell, and document any errors, and hope you don't get a series of beeps, which would be a post error. Power on self-test post. And those are the 10 steps going backwards from what we just talked about, uninstalling. Everybody got screenshots? We're all experts on this now. Mark and I can go play video games for the rest of the day.
Ask questions, guys. Be curious. It won't hurt anything. You know, you never know. Somebody might have been waiting to ask the same question.
All right. Understood, Julian. All right. So we're all experts now. You see the first step and the last step. Yes, Glean?
Supply. As far as reconnecting it, is that the very last thing that you want to put something back into the PC?
Reconnecting what?
The power supply to everything.
Well, you would put the actual power cable externally into the power supply and then plug it into the wall.
Right, gotcha. No, but I mean, like, because there are cables that come from the power supply that you have to connect onto your board, correct? Yes or no?
Yes, that was like in step 3, I believe.
Right. So that's all right. So in other words, you assemble that. Then you
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
All right.
we got all the all the internal connectors. So connect all cables from the power supply and all that kind of fun stuff. That's all right here, steps 3 and 4. That's all your internal stuff. You only plug it in after you've put the external case back on it and you're not opening it up again. That's only when you plug it into the wall.
Okay. That's what I wanted to be sure about. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Since we are all now experts, we should be able to whip through this in no time flat.